Well, I want to welcome everyone to the beginning of this year's Snowbird Symposium. 2018 promises to be a very exciting year. There are elections taking place in lots of different places. Of course, the midterm elections in the United States. There are elections in Germany, in France, and of course in Mexico. And astonishingly, the current president, Peña Nieto, has not anointed his successor to the presidency of Mexico, which is often the way things work in Mexican politics. So we'll have the opportunity to talk more about Mexican politics and to bring in our Mexican friends who are far more versed in this than we are. I thought it would be interesting to start off 2018 by looking back at the last 10 years and the latest crisis of capitalism, which took place 10 years ago, as we all remember. We remember that before we talk about exactly what happened in 10 years ago, let's go back just a little bit further. Why capitalism? I mean, has anybody asked themselves, how do we end up with this system that seems to be, they call it a free market and services and goods, and yet it sort of seems to be much more like a casino, and the economy seems to be, well, there seems to be the real economy of, you know, shoes and toilet paper and stuff like that, and then this fictitious economy of Wall Street. And of course the mainstream media pictures the economy as if it were simply Wall Street. There's nothing else except Wall Street. And they've completely forgotten about all the 40 million Americans who are living in poverty. 10% of New York City school children are homeless, which I found shocking. Why do we have this supposed free market and goods and services, and what was this free market intended to replace? It's as if capitalism as a system was created out of whole cloth, just appearing one day, with absolutely no protection for average people against unemployment, poverty, illness, and other disastrous consequences of unbridled economic activity under the guise of the free market. But this system of bugger thy neighbor grew out of a former economic system. And this inheritance shows signs of rebirth. As capitalism evolved out of the rigid medieval class system, we academics are always trying to periodize history and to put things into neat categories. Well, this was the Dark Ages in the middle. Well, first the fall of Rome, 100 years of civil strife, then 100 years of people being in debt, slavery. Oh, and then the good news of 800 years of the Dark Ages. And then, oh, things got even better, 400 years of the Middle Ages. And then, you know, the modern era, since 1600, when we've had capitalism. Well, capitalism was supposed to liberate people from a medieval system which gave rights to the kings, the aristocrats, the clergy, the Roman Catholic Church. As capitalism evolved out of this rigid medieval class system, those who were born into medieval's ruling classes inherited vast amounts of wealth, enormous tracts of land, powers of monopoly, control over the economy, and most importantly, vast control over the labor of the 95% or so of the population who lived as serfs. The system benefited the overseers, the kings, the czars, the aristocrats, the Roman Church hierarchy. And it was against this medieval society of inherited privilege that average people were trying to break through and to be able to participate in the economy in some way. So instead of, you know, having a society where you had to do one day a week or one day a month of work for the Lord, on whose manor you lived in exchange for protection from marauding armies, in exchange for you know, the local lords who had monopolies on the sale of all kinds of things, especially things like salt. The salt tax of the day was most hated. It was to move beyond this rigid class system that merchants and entrepreneurs of other sorts wanted to break through the power of this hierarchy, which included the Roman Catholic Church as well as the aristocracy and the king. Now, the intellectual movement of the 18th century, we recall, was called the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment challenged the divine right of kings and aristocracies. Kings actually had the divine right to rule. I mean, God said they could rule. And it was against this kind of system that a market system started to grow. Michael Hudson, who's the most prescient of today's economists writing, commented on the development of today's surprise reappearance of a rent-seeking economy, saying, and this is a quote from Michael Hudson, this is not, referring to today, this is not how the Enlightenment was supposed to evolve. The industrial takeoff of Germany and other European nations involved a long fight to free markets from the land rents and financial charges siphoned off by the landed aristocracies and bankers. That was the essence of classical 19th century political economy and 20th century social democracy. Most economists a century ago, Adam Smith, David Ricardo, among others. Most economists a century ago expected industrial capitalism to produce an economy of abundance and democratic reforms, to endorse and support public infrastructure, investment, and regulation to hold down the cost of living and doing business. Have you heard that on CNN lately? Have you heard that anywhere lately? Let me repeat. Most economists a century ago, Adam Smith, David Ricardo, Fourier, John Stuart Mill, Locke, Saint-Simon, expected industrial capitalism to produce an economy of abundance and democratic reforms, to support public infrastructure and regulation to hold down the cost of living and doing business. There's a long literature of 19th century economists writing about the fair cost of products. How can businesses charge what is the fair cost of a given product, rather than abuse monopoly privileges to gain the upper hand, or rather than branding. Today we have branding instead. Developing a brand like the Trump brand, which charges far more than anything else comparable, but it's the brand that you're buying rather than whatever the content is. In other words, the economy was actually supposed to serve the average people and not the landed aristocracy. In the 18th and up to the middle of the 19th century, equality was a demand. People wanted equality. They wanted equality with the lords and the aristocrats. Remember the old idea of poaching, that you couldn't go hunting on the local lord's land and shoot a rabbit and eat it for dinner on pain of death? People wanted freedom from that. They wanted equality under the law. So we have to keep in mind where all of this discourse about free trade comes from. It comes from a totally different world where there really wasn't free trade at all. And free trade had a totally different meaning. So the demand in the 18th century for liberté, égalité, et fraternité, the slogan of the French Revolution, was not a request or a suggestion, it was a demand. People had had enough. People went around France collecting complaints from the peasants. They actually put together what they call the cahier des doléances, the notebook of complaints, and presented it to the king and compelled the King of France to convoke the government of the Trois États, the three estates, which was the first time in over 100 years that the government had actually been brought together to discuss concerns of people. And the people were complaining that the king, the aristocracy, the clergy were abusing their power. And these demands were pursued by what has since been called, of course, as you know, the French Revolution. And it wasn't very pretty. It involved murdering royalty, aristocracy, clergy, but that was the point to which people were driven. But equality was apparent only within 50, 60 years of the French Revolution, 1789, a series of workers' strikes in 1848 led to a Europe-wide uprising. The brutal suppression of this uprising made it clear that for the bourgeoisie, humanity included just the owning class and not the working class. And even today, you've heard the expression zones of sacrifice. There are parts of the world that, well, too bad. They're just a zone of sacrifice. Most of the Middle East, a lot of Africa. So once again, we're actually dividing humans among those who deserve to live and those who really just don't count. As you all know, but the dream of the Enlightenment still inspires people to search for and struggle for equality and freedom, whether you call it social democracy or something else. The idea is that no one is born into legal privilege that grants him or her enormous wealth and power over other people. I remember my father, who was a historian, a Thomas Jefferson specialist, his name had at the end of it, the second. You know, he was Albert Bowman the second. And he dropped the second. He said, there is no aristocracy in the United States. And so I've always been proud of him for doing that. In the United States, recently, the capital of capitalism, the belly of the beast, there has just been passed a tax bill that shifts the tax burden onto workers from the wealthy. Now, the amount of income taken in by the top 1% is now about the same as it was in 1929. The amount of taxes paid by the wealthy is about the same percentage of gross revenues as was paid in 1929. So not only is this new tax law relieving the wealthy from yet more taxes, they're also proposing to eliminate the estate tax, among many other measures facilitating paper wealth. Now, to eliminate the estate tax means that these, essentially kings and oligarchies, these families like the Morgans and the Rockefellers and the DuPonts, they can keep all of the wealth that the workers have created for them, and they can essentially keep this inherited wealth. They're sort of the having made billions in ways that might merit jail sentences. These super wealthy winners are hoping to keep all of their ill-gotten gains. and returned, therefore, to a neo-feudal kind of situation. Now, allowing inherited wealth codifies and perpetuates the current polarized class structure and dismisses all promise of upward mobility. This is capitalism throwing in the towel. Another phrase for it would be making good on ill-gotten gains and exiting as the casino collapses. Well, what is the instrument for this counter-revolutionary neo-feudalism? How has this happened? Well, the main way that this has happened is through debt and debt peonage. It's now common knowledge that wages have been flat since about 1975, except for the top executives. Workers have not had raises commensurate with productivity gains for 40 years. How do they keep up their standard of living? Through debt and the new Walmart economy. In the so-called advanced economies, individuals are in debt up to their eyeballs. Students leave college with huge amounts of debts. Banks gleefully showered subprime mortgages on individuals throughout the first decade of the century, loading people with debt, often leading to foreclosure. Because wages have been stagnant since about 1975, people have tried to maintain their so-called middle-class lifestyle with credit card debt. Student debt now stands at over $1 trillion. Credit card debt stands at over $1 trillion. And yet, banks have $1 or $2 trillion stashed away. Corporations have a couple $1 trillion stashed away that they're not investing in the real economy. They're not organizing production and putting people to work. It's sort of like a capital strike. They're refusing to invest unless they can continually increase their profit margins. And these corporations have used a lot of this money to buy other corporations and also to buy back their own stock. So stock buybacks is a very good way to up the price of the stock of your company. You've heard the expression pump and dump. You buy a lot of stock of some company, goes up, 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 and then you sell it quickly. You get out fast, and then everybody else is left with the results. Offshore tax havens have $20 to $30 trillion, which is hidden from the tax man. So this lopsided, huge mountain of debt on the one hand, and then a mountain of hoarded money. I mean, remember during the potato famine in Ireland and the English were hoarding the potatoes? It was considered a crime to hoard and to not give to those who were dying. But today, hey, it's just business as usual. Ancient civilizations solved their problems of this inexorable concentration of wealth by revolution. And a new leader would come to dominate and would proclaim a debt jubilee. This happened from the Sumerians and the Babylonians and throughout ancient history. The Roman Catholic Church tried to proclaim a debt jubilee for third world countries in the year 2000. You might remember the debt jubilee movement of 2000. But today people are as burdened with debt as they were hundreds of years ago. We're going backwards. Usually under capitalism, if you are insolvent, you lose your investment. But if you're too big to fail and too big to jail, you get a bailout. The modest, remember the modest 800 billion TARP, Troubled Asset Relief Plan, that was proposed by Henry Paulson, the former CEO of Goldman Sachs, when he was the Secretary of the Treasury. That plan was proposed on September 20th, and it was defeated by Congress on Saturday, September 27th. The day that the market could open, on Monday, September 29, the market collapsed. And so we know from Michel Chossudovsky and his team of researchers that people on the inside, in the know, shorted their stock, which means you bet that the stock is going to go down. So they made billions shorting their stock on Monday when the market collapsed. Oh, there's not going to be a bailout. Oh no, it's the end of the world. The stock market collapses. And then, hey, the next day, all of a sudden, no, maybe there will be a bailout. The next day, the market goes way up again. So, you know, the bandits are just making out like thieves, coming and going. And this little $800 billion TARP program was just the beginning of the torrent of $20 to $25 trillion of quantitative easing undertaken by central banks around the world to save the international financial system. Now, we can sort of imagine $1 million. We can sort of imagine $1 billion. But $1 trillion? I mean, that's really hard to imagine. $1 trillion has 12 zeros in it. It's a humongous amount of money. Jack Rasmus in Z magazine counts up the cost of the bailout and the subsequent quantitative easing programs carried out by the Federal Reserve and central banks in the major dollar economies since then. And I'm quoting from him. In the U.S., the Fed officially purchased $4.5 trillion in bad assets between 2009 and 2014. The European Central Bank, as of 2017, has bailed out European banks to the tune of $4.9 trillion so far. The Bank of England, another $7 trillion. And the Bank of Japan, as of mid-last year, more than $5 trillion. The People's Bank of China bailouts amount to around $6 trillion. That's at least $21 trillion poured into the global economy. And yet we can't have health care. We can't have housing for the homeless. We can't have decent care for people who need it. And yet the banks, you know, they get 21 trillion just to save the banking system. And of course what they're going to do next is they're going to say, oh, well now we've passed this new tax law and there are no more taxes on estates and taxes on corporations, and gosh, we're going to have to cut Medicare and Medicaid, and we're going to have to cut Social Security because there's just not enough money. Watch. They'll do it. They'll try. Now, so why has there been no recovery in the real economy and only in the stock market economy? You know, $20 trillion poured into the global economy, you know, that's a lot of money. You know, there should have been a really marked recovery from the crash of 2000, 2008. Well, instead of investing in productive assets, banks and corporations have used the money to buy assets around the world, buy back their stock shares to boost their stock prices, and they're speculating in derivatives. In addition to the mountains of debt used in the quantitative easing programs, there is a quadrillion dollars of derivatives out there. Derivatives derive value from bets on will a mortgage-backed security be good or not. I don't understand this, but a quadrillion dollars of derivatives on top of this mountain of debt, on top of all of this money that's already been dumped into the global system. Where does all this money come from? You know, only banks can create money. Governments do not create money. Only banks create money. There's no limited amount of money that circulates indefinitely, such as when the dollar was linked to gold. Remember back in 1971 when Nixon took the US dollar off the gold standard? Well, he did that because the Vietnam War was costing a lot of money, and he needed to increase the money supply, and delinking the dollar from the supply of gold that was held by the US government was one way of doing that. But banks create money as debt, and debt implies interest. So whenever you take out a mortgage, a car loan, a home improvement loan, a payday loan, a student loan, you are allowing some bank to create money, but money as debt. And this mountain of debt is unstable, to say the least, especially when the next crisis hits. You know, people talk about, well, my monthly income is X, but I have to pay, you know, half of that every month in interest payments on the money I've borrowed to maintain my lifestyle. Well, when the amount of money you have to put out every month in interest just to cover the interest payments gets up close to the amount of money that you actually earn, you're in big trouble. Unless you're a bank, of course, and then you can get a bailout. So borrowing money at credit, if it creates new value to put back into the economy to repay the interest, is okay, but that is not what has been happening. And today there are huge amounts of money that are being poured into the high-tech industry. Of course, we're all familiar with the cameras that we see all around the world as we go about our days, the surveillance systems, the robotic systems. We have airplanes that don't have pilots, they're called drones. They're working on cars that don't have drivers, but that drive themselves, which actually might be an improvement, but I'm not sure. So all this high-tech surveillance, robots as guards and police. It's a pretty frightening picture. William Robinson squeezes into one paragraph the stakes that we are now facing. He says the structural crisis of capitalism in the 1970s. Okay, remember the 1970s? That was the overaccumulation crisis, flat wages that didn't allow increased consumption, which then provoked production to move to other low-wage countries. The structural crisis of capitalism in the 70s launched the world on the path to neoliberal globalization, outsourcing production to low-wage areas. The bursting of the dot-com bubble in 2000 then threw the world into recession. I imagine that you all remember that. Some $5 to $7 trillion of value was wiped off the stock exchanges in 2001. So we're going from crisis, the crisis of the 70s, that has one kind of solution, but that doesn't work out so well. Then there's another crisis, the dot-com bubble, in 2000, and then in 2000, the bursting of the housing bubble in 2008 triggered the worst crisis since the 1930s. And everybody knew that this was going to happen. You might remember the article in the New Yorker called 8 Days in September. It was a blow-by-blow account of the Hank Paulson, Jamie Dimon, Lloyd Blank, Fine, all of these guys getting together to figure out what to do about how to keep everything from collapsing. The head of AIG, I've got this in here somewhere. Anyway, it has the New Yorker had a very good article going through step by step the meeting that took place in the bottom of the New York Federal Reserve. So the bursting of the housing bubble in 2008, which they knew was going to happen. I mean, when you talk about liar loans, ninja loans, no job, no assets, when people are being sent out to force to coax people into taking out subprime loans, just because they could then put together all of these mortgage loans and package them as mortgage-backed securities so that they could then sell them in the secondary capital markets and make a lot of money on fees, which was the goal of all of this. The bursting of the housing bubble in 2008 triggered the worst crisis since the 1930s. And everybody knew it was going to happen, even though Alan Greenspan said no one saw it coming. But he certainly did. They all did. And they got their friends like Hank Paulson to help them out. Who was, as head of the Treasury, he could do so. Robinson continues, everything indicates that the current tech boom is generating a new bubble that could bring another crisis when it bursts, perhaps in conjunction with debt defaults. The next Great Recession is likely to cement this fusion of digital economy and global police state, absent a change, of course, forced on the system by mass mobilization and popular struggle from below. Well, it is true that the U.S. economy is based on production for military uses and surveillance uses. There are over 1,000 U.S. military bases in the U.S. and another 1,000 outside the U.S. Actually, they don't even know quite how many they have. Without military production, the U.S. would have virtually no production at all and no economy. This year's military budget is about $1.5 trillion. I mean, this is a crazy kind of capitalism where what is produced is bought by the government with money borrowed from the wealthy and is then blown up, killing many hundreds of thousands in the process and the historical heritage of the world, so that more military weaponry needs to be bought and more money needs to be borrowed and is blown up again. The cycle keeps going. Yet, let me repeat the optimism in William Robinson's quote, the next Great Recession is likely to cement this form of digital economy and global police state, absent a change of course, forced on the system by mass mobilization and popular struggle from below. We are that change of course, which will be forced on the system by mass mobilization and popular struggle from below. We have to be. Everyone has to be. We're that mass mobilization that will change the possible trajectory of the continual crises of capitalism that keep getting played out. We're getting to where there is no solution that is short of a police state and repression and zones of sacrifice that spread wider and wider around the world. But there is opposition everywhere. There is opposition. The indigenous peoples of the Western Hemisphere are coming together to oppose all the gas pipelines and the oil pipelines. It'll be very interesting to see what happens in China. Over the last 4 or 5 days, there have been huge demonstrations in Iran because the Iranians, of course, are worried that Trump is not going to certify the nuclear deal that Obama came up with as being followed by the Iranians, and that he'll pick a fight with the Iranians. We're at a very dicey point in history, but also a very interesting point in history, and also one where what we do really makes a difference. So, thank you. I'll stop there.
Now the floor is open for questions and comments from anyone. I'll let you call on people.
First of all, thank you for the bit of optimism. I really always appreciate that from global justice. Going from, the negative news and everything is bad to saying, this is what we might do. That's great, and I really appreciate it. The 21 trillion in global easing, was that only banks or was that more than banks?
It was quantitative easing, and it was done by the central banks of different countries. Bank of Japan, Bank of England, People's Bank of China. Yeah, it was done by the banks.
By the banks. And did some of the help go to the people with the more bad mortgages, etc., that in the U.S. we were trying to do at that time?
I don't think very much went to reduce the mortgages that people had taken out.
That was a goal at the time.
Yeah.
There was some lagging of that. I don't know if it ever came to this.
I don't think they ever.
The U.S. government tried to. There were some initiatives to bail out mortgage holders, but that failed. And what did happen was there was a minor program which was very undersubscribed and unimplemented. So the bailout was a bailout of the banks rather than the mortgage holders.
Okay, so that
Never really happened.
Well, two things. One, you said that only the banks create money, but doesn't the Treasury also creates money too in terms of putting it into the money supply? Doesn't it? That's how we got into trouble in the 70s because they kept putting money in order to pay for the Vietnam War. Does that seem right?
According to the U.S. Constitution, the U.S. government and the Treasury Department can mint coins, but they can't print money. So banks create computer money on their keyboards as loans. It doesn't really make a lot of sense, but that's.
So that's how the Vietnam War was supported?
So what happened?
But that's the way it is.
Is that the Treasury and the Fed in particular allow, like they have reserves, right? And if you're don't see any opportunity for loans, you don't lend the money. If you don't lend the money supply doesn't increase. So what happened was during the Vietnam War, the reserves were expended in the banks, and the banks saw a booming economy, and they expanded the loans, and so the money supply expanded big time, and you had inflation.
So now they're going to loan money to the government to pay for the war.
Yeah, actually, the Treasury Department creates Treasury bonds, which are bought by banks. Yeah, so the government creates debt.
That's great.
Oh, well, the government spends money on its own account as well.
Yeah.
Like if they're buying all kinds of armaments. Now they can fund that either through taxation or through bonds.
Yeah, bonds, as the gentleman says. And so they get all that money. And what do they do with that money?
Who gets the money?
Treasury gets the money. They sell.
Well, they give it to the Department of Defense who buys it.
Right.
And pay the interest on other bonds.
Yeah.
Interest on other bonds.
So they can create more bonds to pay.
A good percentage of your issue of a bond is to take the interest on the old bonds.
That's right. Sure.
And bonds, of course, being debt, that's why the U.S. military budget is so high, is because if you count in all of the money that is paid in interest on previous bonds, you end up with something that is far more than what you'll ever find in a government chart of the U.S. Defense Department budget or the special appropriations for Iraq, special appropriations for Afghanistan, special appropriations for the black hole over there, special appropriations for security and so forth.
I believe the Chinese buy a lot of our treasuries. I think that's true. What would happen if they stopped?
Well, I think the Chinese have stopped buying U.S. treasuries. And something that we should, that I want to investigate is something called the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the SCO. China, Russia, India, Brazil, South Africa are setting up an alternative banking system. So on the one hand, you have the world of the dollar with the IMF, the World Bank, the WTO, and the European economies, and of course poor Latin America gets thrown in there with the other dollar-based economies. But then you also have these other economies that are working on establishing the financial structures for doing trade in other currencies. There's also something called the Bank of International Settlements in Basel, through which everything is cleared and coordinated, and they'll need to organize something like that as well. And they're working on an alternative banking system to the US dollar-based City of London-based system as fast as they can.
And that's also heading to something that it hasn't been mentioned here, which is the end of the petrodollar.
Yeah.
Which is what?
The end of the petrodollar.
Oh, yeah.
So by China and Russia creating another system, they basically stop buying treasury bonds because they won't get any interest on it.
Right.
The Federal Reserve is suppressing those interests up to almost 0%. They're not getting anything. So for them, it doesn't make any sense to keep buying
Right.
those bonds because
It's
they're.
not a problem if China stops buying the bonds. I mean, the reason China was buying bonds was because China was selling more to the U.S. than the U.S. was selling to China. So they have a lot of cash. So what they do is they turn around and they buy the Well, they have to change the yuan into dollars. What that does is it props up the value of the dollar and suppresses the value of the yuan, which allows them to sell more, right? So it's in their advantage to do that. And the other thing that happens is when they buy U.S. treasuries, the demand for the treasuries is higher. What that means is the interest rates are higher. They're working against the Fed. And what that does is it also props up the dollar, which means that the Chinese can sell more to the U.S. So by the Chinese not buying bonds, what they're doing is they're acting against their own short-term economic interests. So it's not a problem if they stop.
It's going to be a problem, yes. Because the US government can create as many money as they can, well, notes, because it's not real money. If you just keep printing money, but at the end, you can print money as many trillions you can want, but you cannot print food at the end. So that's the problem, and that's inflation, hyperinflation.
Well, you know, there's a huge amount of excess capacity in China and in the U.S. So the definition of inflation is $2 million or whatever money chasing these few goods. When you have all this excess capacity, you're not going to get inflation.
You know, I'm sorry?
If you have all this excess capacity, you're not going to get inflation.
Excess capacity of resources.
Excess capacity, manufacturing, labor, resources. A lot of excess capacity in the whole system. The U.S. and in particular China. China has been investing vast amounts of money in manufacturing, and as a result, they can produce more than we consume.
Yeah, that would be assuming it is a healthy economy, but I think there's a reason why the quantitative is in, because there's no money velocity, which contracts what you're saying about the economy, a good economy. It's not a good economy. It's being based on just fantasy, creating money out of nothing and putting it into the system. That's why people receiving pension and everything, entitlements because of that.
Ellen Brown writes a lot about the fear of hyperinflation and her view that hyperinflation will not happen because there is so much excess capacity and there is so much pent-up demand. There's so much need, and there's so many people who need things around the world that there won't be hyperinflation.
But that was back in 1987. So here we are, 2008, after 30 years. Can that game keep coming or going all the time? That's the problem.
Can what?
Can the game keep going since 1987?
Well, that is the question.
Yes, that was 30 years ago, 1987, that crash. That was then the dot-com bubble, housing market. Yeah.
There have been several crashes since then.
So they've been bailing out those banks every time. So can they bring money for infinity and hope not to happen anything?
I think it depends upon what we do. I think it depends upon the capacity or the ability of the transnational capitalist class to repress dissent is awesome. The surveillance police state is truly frightening. But I think it depends upon what we do. And if we can organize and people are organizing all over the planet in different kinds of affinity groups, you might say. And I think that it's going to be very interesting to see. I don't know. No one knows what's going to happen.
Yeah.
I think bond prices are going way up relative to return mortgage bonds. You're seeing asset inflation in terms of land. So that's what's happening because of the very low interest rates. That's what's happening. What you're not seeing is commodity inflation because of the
Right.
excess capacity.
Oh, sure, you are. If you go to the store, everything is expensive. That's inflation.
But it's not hyperinflation, it's
No,
not
it's not. It's
hyperinflation.
not. But I mean,
But
although it
asset inflation is where the inflation is. You know, in housing and in land and so forth.
Where was the Chossudovsky reference to Michael?
The global economic, he works out of a think tank in Ottawa, at the University of Ottawa, and he and his team put out a book a number of years ago called the Global Economic Crisis, and it comes out of GRE, Global Research, or Global Research. Do you remember exactly what it is?
Yeah.
But if you can spell his name, Chossudovsky, Choduvsky, Michel Chossudovsky, is that right?
CHOSSU.
Yeah.
There are other people who've been trying to raise points. This gentleman in the front.
I had a couple of observations.
In the back.
One is your straw man of the Mellons and Chases and all of that, they long since put their money in trust. So none of that, those aren't the people who benefit from estate tax changes. The people who benefit from estate tax changes are Wall Street stockbrokers whose kids are going to want to inherit the money that they generate, and small businessmen all over the country who build up their businesses over long periods of time. I can't say whether the change in the estate tax is a good thing or a bad thing. Net, I would guess it's just another way of throwing money away, thing which we do a lot of different ways.
Right.
I, for a while, consulted for state tax organizations. They knew that they could make about, I think the number was $500,000 for every auditor they put on their payroll, who cost them $50,000. So there was a 10-to-1 multiplier they could get from simply pursuing tax fraud. Their state legislatures prevented them from budgeting for that, which is pretty good indication that they didn't really actually want the money if it caused any trouble for their source of campaign contributions.
Their donor class.
Their donor class.
Yeah.
Another one is, I discovered at some point that you can track China's exports by looking at the cost of cardboard, because all of that has to be shipped. It's shipped in cardboard boxes, and for a long while the Australians were shipping cardboard for recycling purposes to China, and when this recession struck China, the cardboard shipments fell to nothing. So that's one index you can kind of follow if you want to know how the Chinese are doing in overseas sales. I guess the last point, student debt is directly a function, in my mind, of the kind of Ponzi game that the universities have created. University salaries have now gone, particularly for the administrative sector, gone astronomically high compared to when I was in university. I got an Ivy League degree and left with $4,000 worth of student debt. My grandkid got a degree from a not very prestigious university and has $160,000 worth of student debt. And something changed dramatically in the 40 years between those two events.
What happened is that they started, something like 80 or 90% of college courses are taught by part-time faculty, by adjunct faculty, who are paid $2,000 to $3,000 per course that they teach. I have friends in New York who teach 8 or 9 courses a semester. They used to publish the ratio of faculty to administrators. And I got my degree at Columbia, and the ratio was 1 to 3 when I started graduate school in '75. And then they stopped publishing that number. And my father, who was an academic, was saying, I don't understand where all of these assistant deans and assistant to assistant deans and all of this huge bureaucracy of administrators in the universities came from, whereas the faculty, the teachers, were getting paid less and less and less. And a lot of our friends who are now in their 70s are still teaching because they know that if they retire, quote unquote retire, they won't be replaced. And they certainly will not be replaced with someone who has my views on economics or Cliff's views on economics, or probably anyone here in this room with their views.
And they're all adjunct profs, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, Steve had
Yeah.
his hand up.
Yeah, just to follow up on that last comment, I read somewhere recently that Harvard University described as a $38 billion hedge fund that offers an occasional course once in a while.
Right.
I thought it was interesting that your use of the term sacrifice zones in kind of a global context, and Chris Hedges and Joe Sacco published a book on exactly that topic about the United States about 5 years ago called Days of Destruction, Days of Revolt.
Yeah.
I wanted to say a couple things about, read recently about an increasing tendency to wrap student loan debt into derivatives and hedge fund situations because they're in most ways unforgivable debt. So they make the derivatives more attractive. The second thing I read recently, I don't know if anybody knows anything about it, but there's a thought that because there are going to be some modest, albeit temporary, reductions in income taxes for even lower and middle income people, that in itself will be used by the capitalists as a justification for reducing wages because it won't cost as much for those people they'll have more money to live on and be paying less taxes, so they'll drive the wages down, actually.
And manufacturing will come back to the United States at $6 an hour, $7 an hour.
I wanted to raise a point about what corporations are doing with all of the surplus capital. And you referred to the fact that a lot is being used to buy back stock. The consequence of that is that the corporations then become increasingly self-governing. I mean, the whole idea was supposed to be that the corporations respond to the investors.
Right.
But if corporations end up with few, if any, investors, then the CEOs, the top management, will have no accountability to anybody else. They become basically the ruling class of the dominant economic institutions of society.
They are.
They already are.
They are the core.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. And the other thing that you did not mention is one of the things that corporations are doing with a lot of their surplus capital is investing it abroad.
Oh, yeah.
And, there isn't favorable enough rate of return on investing in productive things within the U.S., but there's a very favorable rate of return on investment in low-wage third world countries. And that's where much of the growth of capitalism is occurring these days. You referred to the countries of the global south seeking to form an alternative monetary system. It may well be that while capitalism could collapse within the U.S., that it could continue to thrive in the global south.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. You want to expand on any of that?
Well, I think that that is something that might happen. Someone mentioned cardboard. You also look at shipping corporations, boats.
Some of those are in big trouble.
Yeah, exactly. They're in big trouble because they don't have stuff to ship around the world because people are not buying stuff. People don't have money to buy this stuff anymore. Something like 18 out of the 20 big shipping companies, according to Richard Wolff, made absolutely no profit in 2016. So, sometimes I imagine that, as capitalism sort of implodes and collapses from within in the United States and Latin America, because it's all in Canada, because we're all so closely tied together economically. But other parts of the world, like Russia and China and India, they'll rise and they will become the dominant economic powers. And I think that there's no question that China will be the world's next superpower.
But is it those countries as nations that will be dominant, or will it be the transnational corporations that have no nationality?
Well, that's a very good question.
Just as a footnote to that, I have a lot of Indian friends and I spend a lot of time in India. And India is way better off today than it was 20, 30 years ago because of the movement of labor to India. It's made for a good deal better standard of living in the cities of India. It doesn't spread to the rural parts where there's still a guy with a plow who looks suspiciously like a Mexican of the 19th century. But at least parts of India are a lot more prosperous today than they were, and that's a benefit if you can allow yourself not to think nationalistically.
Right, right. Well, I think once they got the British out and the British stopped stealing and they kept some of the value in their country, I would expect India to be better off.
My friend in northern India says, this is a footnote and really doesn't belong in this conversation, but he says, we were slaves for 500 years. And now we still have slave mentality in certain respects, particularly as regards the individual sense of respect. They feel now that that's a piece of capital that they hold more dearly than a lot of other countries, to people feeling like they demand respect. And respect is a big currency of the Indian social environment. But things have improved, and perhaps they'll gradually spill out to the poorer of the countryside.
Yeah, people throughout Latin America are talking about what they want is a dignified life. Because they've had 500 years of essentially slavery with the English and the Spanish and the Portuguese.
Any other questions or comments from anyone? We've had an interesting and wide-ranging discussion. Yes?
You mentioned alternative currency to the dollar backed by Russia, China, and South Africa. I also understand there's one being run around, backed by Venezuela and other South American countries. Is there anything about that?
Could you repeat that? I didn't hear you very well.
An alternative currency to the dollar backed by Venezuela and other South American countries. Have you heard anything about that?
I heard about that.
Yeah.
That's what is coming. That's about the BRICS countries, which is Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa.
But this one's going to start from Venezuela.
Even Venezuela now, they're going to be using a cryptocurrency to bypass the US dollars.
When that occurs, the dollar will be virtually worthless for them.
Right.
Actually, that's what I'm explaining is like we are living those days and no one seems to be aware of what is happening.
Right.
The time is going to come when the dollar is going to start being the world reserve currency. That happened with Portugal, Spain, England, and it's going to happen with the USA. And it's happening right now. That's why you see China, Russia, North Korea, Iran creating their own system. So they can separate from the US dollar. Because the US dollar isn't just printing money, it's even an expenses for the world by just exporting dollars and bringing goods to the USA. And for them, it doesn't make any sense.
Do you know
Yeah,
if
so-
ALBA fits into that?
Pardon?
If ALBA fits into that?
Well, what Venezuela sponsored was the formation of a Latin American currency among the ALBA countries called the Sucre. And I mean, since Venezuela has run into financial problems as a result of the decline of the price of oil, I'm not sure how the Sucre is faring, but it was being used as a currency of account for trade among the ALBA countries.
I just have something to add to that. I have a nephew who works for HSBC in New York, and his job in the past has been to deal with Latin America countries and bring them maybe to China or other, and the U.S. to get funding for bonds, like for, I know they did the Mexico City airport with Mexico. They've done all kinds of funding. He told me a few months ago that Latin America, they've said, we're not doing business with you much anymore because we don't trust Trump, we don't like the way he talks about us, we're going to the Chinese. And the Chinese are doing a lot of stuff in Africa and Latin America. I really think we're in trouble. I really do. They don't want to deal with us because of Trump.
Yeah, and I think they're right. And from what I understand of the Mexico City airport, they plan on it to only sink 6 inches every year. So I don't know why they're building more runways at the...
6 inches a year?
Yeah.
Oh, that's all, okay.
I think that precedes Trump, actually. When we were in the Caribbean, we found Chinese building soccer pitches and cricket pitches all through the Caribbean in return for the implicit vote at the UN for Chinese interests. So, and it was all free. We'll just build this for you. But
Yes, I agree with you. But what he said last March when all the finance ministers were in Washington for the import-export, all that stuff, he said the change was the lending for these bonds. As HSBC's been a big lender, they're saying, not so much anymore, we're not going to go to the U.S. We're going to...
It is clearly see what is happening when you see like 1 billion of Chinese young people, and you see the change of demographics in the USA and aging people. I mean, you can tell the difference. What is the future going to show? I mean, you can see right there. So,
Absolutely.
yeah, I mean, between 65 and 70 million baby boomers retiring since 2016, 10,000 per every day. Where are the monies coming from those pensions? If you don't have new people, younger people. It used to be seven people supporting one pensioner before. Nowadays, how much is the rate? 3 or 2 people?
Yeah,
So
I
that's
don't
what I'm
know.
saying. You cannot bring your into prosperity. I mean, you cannot go into prosperity by just bringing out money.
But I do know that the Social Security Trust Fund has a surplus. They run a surplus every year. And you might remember back in 2000, Al Gore talking about putting the surplus from the Social Security Trust Fund into a lockbox so that it wouldn't be borrowed by the government. But the Republican government and the Clintons have borrowed the Social Security surplus every single year since then. So actually, everyone should be getting, or all U.S. citizens should be getting double or triple whatever Social Security they're getting, because there's plenty of money there.
Plenty of fiat money.
Pardon?
Plenty of fiat money, just print paper.
Yeah.
That's my point.
Yeah.
You
There's
can
plenty of
print
fiat money.
fiat money as many as trillion they want. And that the problem is not they cannot print it or resources.